If you sign that, you're giving away your entire company. The words didn't come from the man in the tailored suit at the head of the table. They didn't come from the polished translator standing beside him either. They came from somewhere no one in that room had been paying attention to. A quiet voice. Soft, almost hesitant, but steady enough to cut through everything. And the worst part? Everyone else in that room believed the translation was correct. For a split second, the entire private dining room at the Halston went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that slowly settles in. The kind that arrives all at once. Abrupt, heavy, absolute. The low hum of conversation disappeared. The soft clinking of silverware stopped mid-motion. Even the faint jazz drifting through the speakers seemed to fade into nothing. Every pair of eyes turned. Not toward the deal, not toward the documents, but toward her, a waitress, standing near the edge of the room, her tray still balanced in one hand. Her posture caught somewhere between stepping forward and stepping back. Lily Carter hadn't meant to speak. Not really. In fact, she had spent years training herself not to. She wasn't supposed to understand what they were saying, but she understood everything. She had learned how to move through rooms like this one without leaving a trace. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Refill glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. Clear plates without interrupting conversations that were never meant for her ears. Keep her presence light. Forgettable. Safe. Because people like her were not supposed to interrupt people like them. Not in rooms like this. Not when millions of dollars were being discussed in calm, controlled voices. And definitely not when someone like Ethan Cole was involved. His name alone carried weight. The kind of weight that didn't need to be announced. It showed in the way people adjusted their posture when he spoke. In the way conversations subtly shifted to accommodate his presence. In the quiet authority that followed him without effort. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Power, at that level, rarely was. And yet, here she was, standing, in the center of a moment she was never supposed to be part of. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, the metal cool against her skin. The weight of what she had just said settled over her all at once. Because she knew exactly what she had heard. Not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Every nuance. Every subtle shift in tone. Every carefully disguised intention. Because it was never just about language. It never was. It was about what was said and what was meant. And Lily understood both. Fluently. Effortlessly. Dangerously. But that part of her, the part that could hear beyond the surface, was something she had buried a long time ago. Not because she lost it, but because she learned it didn't belong in the life she was living now. The translator had spoken smoothly, confidently. His English precise, polished, professional. To anyone else in the room, it sounded correct. Reassuring, even. Safe. But Lily had heard the original French. And what he said was not what was written. Not even close. The clause he translated as a minor adjustment wasn't minor. It was control. Ownership percentages had been subtly shifted. Power restructured. Liabilities buried beneath carefully chosen phrasing. Not removed. Just hidden. Disguised well enough that no one without a trained ear would question it. And that was exactly the point. It wasn't a mistake. That was the first thing she knew. Mistakes feel uncertain. This didn't. This was clean. Controlled. Intentional. And Lily recognized that too. Because she had heard it before. In different rooms. In different countries. In different languages. For years, she had let people believe she only spoke English. Let them talk freely around her. French contracts. German negotiations. Japanese politeness masking strategy. Spanish deals wrapped in charm. She translated everything in her head without thinking. It had become instinct. A silent habit she couldn't turn off even if she tried. But habits like that come with consequences. Because eventually, you hear something you're not supposed to ignore. And tonight was that moment. She knew. She should stay quiet. Every instinct told her to. Step back. Lower her gaze. Pretend she hadn't noticed. Let the deal go through. Because speaking up could cost her everything. Her job. Her stability. The fragile balance she had spent years holding together. A life built not on ambition, but survival. A life where knowing 7 languages didn't matter. Because talent didn't pay rent. Connections did. And Lily had neither. So she stayed invisible. Or at least, she tried to. Until something inside her refused to let it go. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just persistent. A quiet resistance she couldn't silence. Maybe it was the memory of who she used to be. Or maybe some truths are simply too big to ignore. And now, standing there, with every eye in the room fixed on her, Lily realized something that made her chest tighten. There was no taking it back. The translator's expression shifted first, only slightly, a flicker of something sharp beneath his controlled composure. The executives exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Confusion, doubt, annoyance, all mixing together in restrained, careful reactions. And at the center of it all, Ethan Cole leaned back in his chair. Slowly, deliberately, his gaze locked onto hers. Not angry, not surprised. Something else. Something far more unsettling. Curiosity. The kind that doesn't miss details. The kind that doesn't dismiss anomalies. The kind that sees value before anyone else does. As if he had just discovered something he wasn't looking for, but instantly recognized as important. And for the first time since she spoke, Lily felt something colder than fear settle in her chest. Awareness. She hadn't just interrupted a conversation. She had stepped into something much bigger. A game she didn't understand. A world she didn't belong to. And there was no way out anymore. Except forward. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. And in a room where deals worth tens of millions of dollars were usually sealed with confident handshakes and carefully measured words, that kind of silence didn't just feel unusual. It felt wrong. Heavy. Pressing in from every direction. Lily became painfully aware of everything all at once. The weight of the tray in her hand. The slight tremor in her fingers. The way her uniform suddenly felt too visible. Too out of place. She wasn't supposed to be the center of attention. Not here. Not in front of people who lived in a completely different world. A world where decisions moved markets. Where a single signature could change the course of entire companies. And she was just a waitress. The translator recovered first. He always would. People like him were trained for moments like this. He adjusted his posture slightly, smoothed his cufflink, then offered a polite, controlled smile. The kind designed to calm a room and dismiss a problem at the same time. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. His tone was effortless, professional, reassuring. But Lily knew better. She had heard that tone before. Different languages, different rooms, same intention. Control the narrative. Before anyone questions it. Her instinct told her to step back, to apologize, to say she had misheard, that it wasn't her place, that she was wrong, because that would fix everything, restore the balance, put her back where she belonged. Invisible. But the truth didn't leave. It stayed. Sharp. Uncomfortable. Impossible to ignore. And once you truly understood something like that, you couldn't unhear it. A soft sound broke the tension. Glass against wood. Ethan Cole set his drink down. Slowly. Precisely. The sound was quiet. But in that moment, it cut through the room like a signal. He didn't look at the translator. Didn't look at the documents. Didn't look at anyone else. His eyes stayed on Lily. Explain. One word. Not loud. Not aggressive. But it carried weight. The kind of weight that shifted attention instantly. The kind that made it clear this moment mattered. Lily swallowed. Her throat dry. Every instinct still told her to stop. To let someone else handle it. To disappear back into the role she understood. But there was no one else. No one in that room had caught it. No one else could say what she could. And now, she had been asked. Directly. She took a small step forward. Carefully. As if crossing an invisible line. Then she set the tray down on the nearest table. The quiet clink. Grounding her just enough. The clause about equity distribution, her voice wasn't loud. But it didn't shake. She chose her words carefully. Every syllable measured. Because now, every word mattered. He translated it as a minor adjustment, a slight pause. But in French, she lifted her eyes. Met Ethan's gaze. It's not minor. A shift moved through the room. Subtle, but undeniable. It transfers controlling interest. Another pause. After 12 months. Silence again. But different this time. Not confusion. Not shock. Doubt. One of the executives leaned forward. His brow tightening as he flipped through the document again. Slower this time. More carefully. Another whispered something under his breath. Low. Uneasy. The translator didn't wait. He stepped in immediately. That is an oversimplification. Still calm. Still controlled. But tighter now. Legal language often carries nuance. He didn't finish. Ethan raised his hand. Just slightly. And the translator stopped. Mid-sentence. Not because he had to, but because he understood something. In this room, that gesture meant authority. Absolute. Ethan didn't rush, didn't react emotionally. He reached for the document, pulled it closer, his eyes moving across the page with quiet precision. Lily stood still, every nerve in her body alert. This was the moment, the point where everything could go one of two ways. She had said her piece, but saying something and proving it were not the same. And this wasn't her world. These weren't her rules. The translator tried again, more direct this time. I've worked with international agreements for over 15 years. A subtle shift in tone, less smooth, more defensive. I assure you, my translation is accurate. It was a calculated move. Appeal to authority, experience, hierarchy, the kind of move that usually worked. Because in rooms like this, titles mattered, credentials mattered, reputation mattered, and Lily had none of those things. For a brief second, she felt it again. That weight, that invisible line between her and everyone else. Then Ethan looked up, and everything changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that everyone in the room felt. His expression had sharpened. Not anger, not frustration, clarity. Then let's remove interpretation. The words landed clean, precise, final. He turned slightly, not toward Lily, not toward the translator, toward one of the executives. Get a direct legal translation from our in-house team. A brief pause. Now. No one argued. No one questioned. Phones were pulled out immediately. Messages sent. Calls made. And just like that, the dynamic of the room shifted. The translator didn't move. Not at first. But something in his expression changed. Just for a second. A crack. Small. But real. Because for the first time, this wasn't under his control anymore. Lily exhaled slowly, only then realizing she had been holding her breath. The moment had moved beyond her now. The decision no longer hers. But the consequences still were. She took a small step back, then another, instinctively retreating toward the edge of the room, toward safety, toward invisibility. But before she could disappear, Ethan's voice stopped her. Stay. One word. Quiet. Controlled. But impossible to ignore. Lily froze. For a fraction of a second, she considered walking away anyway, pretending she hadn't heard it. But something told her that wasn't an option anymore. So she nodded, slightly, and stayed, waiting for the truth to catch up with what she already knew. Time moved differently after that. Not faster, not slower, just heavier. Every second stretched. Every small sound felt amplified. The faint buzz of a phone, the soft shift of someone adjusting in their chair, the quiet tapping of a finger against the table. No one spoke, because no one wanted to be the first one to break it. Lily stood where she was, still, waiting, not for validation, not for approval, for confirmation, because she already knew what she had heard. The question was, would anyone else be willing to see it? Across the table, one of the executives checked his phone again, then again, as if staring at the screen long enough might change what it said. The translator remained composed, on the surface, but there were small tells now. Things only someone paying close attention would notice. The slight tightening of his jaw. The way his fingers pressed just a little too firmly against the edge of the table. The delay, barely noticeable, before each controlled breath. He wasn't relaxed anymore. He was waiting. And for the first time since this started, he wasn't in control of the outcome. Ethan hadn't moved. He sat back in his chair, one hand resting lightly against the table, the other still near the document. Watching. Not the translator. Not the executives. Lily. As if this moment wasn't just about the deal, but about her. Then, a sharp vibration cut through the silence. A phone. Short. Sudden. Impossible to ignore. Everyone looked. The executive picked it up. His eyes scanned the screen. Once. Then again. His expression didn't change immediately, which made it worse. Because when people know something is wrong, they don't react right away. They process it first. And that pause, that hesitation, told everyone in the room exactly what they needed to know. He looked up, slowly, met Ethan's gaze, and then said it. It matches what she said. No one moved. For a second, it didn't feel real. Because that single sentence did more than confirm a translation. It rewrote the entire room. The air shifted, subtly, but completely. The translator blinked. Once, then straightened slightly, as if preparing to respond. There must be an error, he stopped. Not because someone interrupted him, but because even he could hear it. How weak it sounded. Moments ago, his words carried authority, confidence, control. Now, they sounded like defense. And defense meant one thing. He had lost ground. One of the executives leaned back in his chair, slowly, processing, recalculating. Another closed the document in front of him, not abruptly, but decisively. The deal was no longer moving forward. Not like this. Phones were picked up again. Messages sent. Quiet conversations began forming in low voices. Not chaotic, not loud, but fractured. The clean, controlled rhythm of a high-level negotiation was gone, replaced by something far less stable. Doubt. And at the center of it all, Lily stood exactly where she had been. But nothing about her position was the same anymore. Just minutes ago, she was invisible. Background. Someone no one needed to notice. Now, every single person in that room knew exactly who she was. Not by name, but by impact. She had stopped a deal worth millions of dollars with a single sentence. Not by force, not by authority, but by being right. And that changed everything. Ethan finally moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to signal a shift. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze still fixed on Lily. And for the first time, there was something new in his expression. Not curiosity, not evaluation, recognition. The faintest hint of something at the corner of his lips. Not quite a smile, but close enough. As if he had just found something he didn't know he was looking for, and instantly understood its value. The translator didn't speak again, because there was nothing left to say. Not in this moment. The truth had already done its job, and it didn't need help. Lily felt it then. Not the fear, not the pressure. Something else. Heavier, but steadier. The realization that what had just happened was real. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't overstepped. She had changed something. Something that mattered. And there was no going back to being invisible after that. Because once people see what you're capable of, they don't forget. The shift in the room was immediate. And irreversible. It didn't happen loudly. There was no argument. No raised voices. Just a quiet unraveling. The translator's authority, once unquestioned, now lingered in the air like something fragile. Cracked. Unstable. He tried to recover. Of course he did. People like him always did. There must be an error in their interpretation as well. His voice remained controlled, carefully measured. But something had changed. Even he could feel it. The confidence was gone, replaced by something sharper, more guarded. And no one responded, because no one believed him anymore. Ethan didn't even look in his direction. Not once. As if the man had already become irrelevant. Instead, his attention remained exactly where it had been. On Lily. And that alone was enough. The rest of the room followed. One of the executives cleared his throat, shifted slightly in his chair. We need to pause this deal. Simple, direct, final. No one argued. Because at this level, trust was everything. And once it cracked, even slightly, everything else followed. Papers were gathered. Phones lit up again. Assistants moved in and out quietly. The structure of the negotiation, the careful rhythm, the control, began to dissolve. Piece by piece. Lily stood there, still, not sure where to put her hands, not sure where she belonged anymore. She wasn't invisible, but she didn't belong here either. Not yet. She took a small step back, then another, instinct pulling her toward the edge of the room, toward familiarity, toward safety, the place where she knew how to exist. But before she could disappear completely, Ethan stood. The movement wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. The entire room adjusted around it. Everyone, give us a moment. Not loud, not forceful, but absolute. Chairs shifted. Soft murmurs filled the air. No one questioned it, because no one needed to. Within seconds, the room began to empty. Executives gathered their documents. Assistants followed. The translator hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then left, without another word. And just like that, the room fell quiet again. But this silence was different. Not tense, not uncertain, focused, intentional. The kind of silence that comes before something important is decided. Lily remained where she was, unsure if she should leave too. Her instinct told her yes. This wasn't her space. This wasn't her world. But before she could move, Ethan's voice stopped her. You too. A pause. Then stay. The contradiction was subtle, but clear. Everyone else was dismissed, but not her. The door closed behind the last person, and suddenly, the room felt larger, quieter, just the two of them, and the faint hum of the city outside the glass walls. Lily swallowed. Without the noise, without the movement, Without the distraction of other people, everything felt sharper, more real. Ethan took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make the distance between them feel intentional. Measured. 7 languages. He said it like a statement, not a question. Lily hesitated. Her first instinct rose immediately: deflect, minimize, hide. I understand enough. Careful, neutral, safe. But Ethan's gaze didn't shift, didn't soften, didn't move away. You understand more than enough. No accusation, just certainty. He studied her for a moment, not like someone judging, but like someone trying to understand something that didn't fit. Why are you working here? The question landed harder than anything else. Because it wasn't really about the job. It was about everything behind it. Every choice, every compromise, every moment that led her here instead of somewhere else. Lily looked down, just for a second, then back up. Because it pays the bills. Simple, direct, true, but incomplete. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. Not pity, not sympathy, recognition, as if he understood more than she had said. You just saved me from signing a deal that would have cost me control of my company. This time, his words carried weight. Not abstract, not distant, real. Lily felt it settle in. Heavier than the silence, heavier than the attention, because it meant something had changed, not just in the room, but in how she was seen. And for the first time, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. Stepping forward hadn't just broken the rules of her world. It had crossed into his. And there was no going back. The words lingered in the air longer than Lily expected. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy. You just saved me from signing a deal that would have cost me control of my company. It wasn't said like a compliment. It wasn't said like gratitude either. It was said like a fact. And somehow, that made it matter more. Lily shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, out of uncertainty. Because people like Ethan Cole didn't usually acknowledge people like her. Not like this. Not in a way that felt real. Not in a way that suggested something had actually changed. She glanced toward the door, half expecting someone to walk back in, to interrupt, to restore everything to the way it was before. But no one came. The room stayed quiet, still, and that made it harder to ignore what was happening. I should get back to work. The words came out almost automatically. Careful, polite, safe, as if stepping back into her role could undo everything that had just happened. As if normal still existed. But Ethan didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't let the moment close. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, watching her. You are already working. The simplicity of the statement caught her off guard. Lily frowned slightly, because that didn't make sense. Work was defined, clear, structured. It had uniforms, schedules, expectations. Not moments like this. Not standing in a room like this. Being asked questions she wasn't supposed to answer. That wasn't my job. Her voice was firmer this time. Grounded. Something she could hold on to. But Ethan didn't argue. Didn't correct her. Maybe it should be. The words were quiet. But they shifted something. Subtle. But undeniable. Because that wasn't just a response. It was a possibility. And possibility was dangerous. Especially when it came from someone who had the power to make it real. Lily shook her head slightly. Almost instinctively. I'm not qualified for whatever you're thinking. It came out quickly. Too quickly. Like something she had said before. More than once. Because as far as the world was concerned, it was true. No degree on the wall. No corporate title. No network. Nothing that validated what she knew. Nothing that made people listen. Just skills she had never been able to use. Knowledge she had learned to hide. Ethan took a small step closer. Not aggressive. Not forceful. Just enough to close the distance between them. You just corrected a multi-million-dollar negotiation in real time. His voice remained calm. Precise. That's qualification. Lily let out a quiet breath. Almost a laugh. But there was no humor in it. Just disbelief. Because he was looking at one moment and seeing potential, while she was looking at the same moment and seeing risk. Consequences. Everything that could go wrong. Or it was a mistake I got lucky with. She said it lightly. Testing the idea, waiting for him to agree, to dismiss it, to let her step back into something familiar. But he didn't. You weren't guessing. Again, not a question. A statement. Certain. Lily hesitated. Because the truth was right there. She had known. From the moment she heard it. And denying that now would be a lie. So instead, she nodded. Once. Small. But real. And that was enough. Something in Ethan's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but decisively, as if a line had just been crossed. Then stop hiding it. For words. Simple, but they landed harder than anything else he had said, because they weren't about the deal. They weren't about the translator. They were about her. About the version of herself she had kept buried. The one that didn't fit into the life she had built. The one she had convinced herself didn't matter anymore. For a moment, Lily didn't respond. Because she didn't know how to. Because those words didn't just challenge what she had done tonight. They challenged everything she had been avoiding for years. And for the first time since this started, the uncertainty she felt wasn't about the room, or the people, or the consequences. It was about something deeper, something far more difficult to ignore. The possibility that she had been choosing to stay invisible, even when she didn't have to. The words stayed with her. Then stop hiding it. They didn't fade. They didn't soften. They settled. Somewhere deeper than she expected. Lily let out a slow breath. It's not that simple. Her voice was quieter now. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just honest. Ethan didn't interrupt. Didn't challenge her. He just watched. And for some reason, that made it easier to keep talking. Knowing something, she paused. Searching for the right words. And having a place to use it, another pause. Are not the same thing. The sentence hung there. Not dramatic. But real. Lily glanced down briefly. Her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table. Grounding herself. People don't exactly line up to hire someone without a degree, she continued. Without connections. There was no self-pity in her voice. Just fact. The kind of truth you don't argue with anymore, because you've already tried. Ethan considered that. Not quickly. Not dismissively. As if he was weighing her words against something else. Something internal. And yet, he said finally, you were the only person in that room who caught it. Lily exhaled softly. Because that wasn't the point. Or at least, not the whole point. Catching it and being listened to, she said. Her eyes lifting again. Meeting his. Are two different things. There it was. The real barrier. Not what she knew, but whether it mattered. Whether anyone was willing to see it. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly. Not in disagreement. In understanding. That depends on who's listening. The words were simple, but they shifted something. Because they weren't general. They were specific. Directed. Lily felt it immediately. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something else. Something closer to an opportunity. Or maybe, a risk. She hesitated. Because that was the part she didn't understand. People like him didn't invest time in people like her. Not without a reason. Why does this matter to you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Because that was the truth. This didn't make sense. Not in her world. Ethan didn't answer right away. He turned slightly. His gaze shifting toward the window. The city stretched out below. Lights flickering. Movement constant. A reminder of how big everything was. How many things existed beyond this moment. Then he spoke. Because I don't like being lied to. Simple. But there was something beneath it. Something firm. And I don't ignore people who tell me the truth. He turned back to her. And that changed everything. Because this wasn't about helping her. It wasn't about kindness. Or sympathy. It was about value. Recognition. Seeing something useful. And choosing not to overlook it. Lily felt that settle in slowly. Reframing the entire moment. This wasn't someone offering her a favor. This was someone acknowledging what she brought. And that made it harder to walk away. Harder to dismiss. What are you actually saying? Her voice was quieter now. More careful. Because she already knew this answer mattered. And this time, Ethan didn't hesitate. I'm saying, a brief pause. You don't belong on the sidelines. The words landed with quiet certainty. And I don't hire people based on where they've been. Another step closer. Not physical, but in meaning. I hire them based on what they can do. Silence followed. But not the same silence as before. This one was different. Open. Like something had just been placed in front of her. And all she had to do was decide whether to take it. The room felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something invisible had shifted. A line had been crossed. And there was no going back to the version of the moment before it. Lily stood there. Still, but not the same. Ethan's words lingered in her mind. You don't belong on the sidelines. It sounded simple when he said it. Almost obvious. But to her, it felt like standing on unstable ground. The kind where one wrong step could collapse everything she had built. She glanced down at herself. At the small details she had never thought twice about before. The faint crease in her sleeve. The simple fabric. The name tag pinned neatly at her chest. Lily. Clean. Ordinary. Defined. That name, in this room, meant something very specific. It meant she served. She followed. She stayed in her place. That was the structure. The boundary. And now, he was asking her to step beyond it. As if it were nothing. You're assuming I want that. Her voice was steady. Not defensive, but careful. Testing. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He watched her again. Not evaluating her ability this time, but something else. Understanding her hesitation. And that made her feel even more exposed. Because it meant he wasn't just seeing what she could do. He was seeing what was holding her back. You didn't stay silent. His voice was calm, almost reflective. People who want to stay where they are, a small pause, usually do. Lily let out a quiet breath. Because that hit deeper than she expected. He was right. She could have said nothing. She almost had. But something in her refused. And now, she had to face what that meant. That doesn't mean I'm ready to change. Everything. Her fingers lightly gripped the edge of the table again, grounding herself, holding onto something solid, something familiar. Ethan nodded once. Not pushing, not dismissing, but not stepping back either. It means you already started. The words were simple, but they landed with quiet certainty. Not as an opinion, as a fact. Lily looked at him. Really looked this time. Trying to understand how someone could be so sure about something that still felt so uncertain to her. And then, she realized something. It wasn't certainty about her. It was certainty about decisions. About recognizing when something mattered and acting on it. Something she had spent years avoiding. What happens if I'm wrong? The question came out before she could stop it. Because that was the real fear. Not failure. But what came after? The consequences. The loss. The fall back to something worse than before. Ethan didn't hesitate. Then you learn. Simple. Direct. And you keep going. No reassurance. No guarantees. Just truth. And somehow, that made it more real. More believable. Lily exhaled slowly. Her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Because for the first time, this didn't feel like a single irreversible leap. It felt like a step. Still uncertain. Still risky. But not impossible. She glanced toward the door. Toward the life she knew. The routine that kept things predictable. Safe. Then back at Ethan. Toward something entirely different. Something without guarantees. Only possibility. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But this silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was open. Like space waiting to be filled. Lily straightened slightly. Her grip on the table loosening. Her hands falling back to her sides. And when she spoke again, her voice was still quiet. But there was something new in it. Something steadier. If I say yes, a small pause, then I don't want this to be about what happened tonight. Her eyes met his. Clear. Direct. I want it to be about what I can actually do. Ethan's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to show he understood exactly what she meant. And more importantly, that he respected it. Good. A faint hint of approval. That's exactly what it will be. And in that moment, the decision wasn't fully made. Not spoken. Not finalized. But it had begun. Taking shape. No longer just a possibility. But something real. Something she was already stepping toward, whether she realized it or not. The moment settled into something quieter. Less about tension. More about direction. As if the room itself had shifted from uncertainty to something clearer. Lily stood there. No longer bracing herself to step back. But not fully stepping forward either. Suspended. Between two versions of her life. The one she knew. And the one she hadn't yet decided to claim. Ethan moved first. Not toward her, but toward the table. He gathered the documents slowly. The same documents that, minutes ago, could have cost him everything. His movements were calm. Controlled. As if nothing about the situation had surprised him. And maybe it hadn't. There's a meeting tomorrow morning. His voice shifted. Less reflective. More direct. 9 a.m. Main office. The words landed clean. No build-up. No explanation. Just expectation. Lily blinked slightly. Tomorrow. The word felt heavier than it should. Because it meant no time. No space to overthink. No distance from this moment. Just a step forward. Waiting. You'll meet my legal team. Ethan continued. We'll review the deal properly. A brief pause. This time, with someone who actually understands what's being said. Not arrogance. Just clarity. Just truth. Lily hesitated. That familiar instinct returned. Slow it down. Delay. Create distance. But something stopped her. Because she understood something now. Waiting wouldn't make this easier. It would only make it disappear. And if I don't show up? The question came out quieter. Not challenging. Testing. Testing what this really was. Ethan didn't hesitate. Then you go back to serving tables. Simple. No judgment. No pressure. Just reality. And I find someone else. That was it. No persuasion. No convincing. No attempt to pull her in. Just a choice. Clear. Unavoidable. Lily felt it settle. Not overwhelming. Not dramatic. Just real. Because in the end, this wasn't about readiness. Or confidence. Or whether. She deserved it. It was about one thing. Whether she would take it. She nodded. Slowly. More to herself than to him. The decision wasn't spoken. Not fully. But it wasn't uncertain anymore. The door opened again. The outside world returned. Voices. Movement. Familiar rhythm. The life she knew. But something had changed. It was still there. Still hers. But not the only option anymore. And as Lily reached for her tray again, her movements steadier now, there was a quiet understanding settling inside her. Tomorrow was no longer just another day. It was a line, and she was about to cross it. The next morning came faster than Lily expected. Not because time had moved differently, but because her mind never really stopped. Sleep had come in fragments. Moments replaying over and over again. The room. The silence. The words she had said. The moment everything changed. 8:57 a.m. She stood outside the glass doors of Ethan Cole's office building. The city was already alive. Cars moving. People walking. Everything continuing as if nothing had happened. As if last night meant nothing. But for her, everything had changed. She glanced at her reflection in the glass. No uniform this time. No tray. No role to hide behind. Just her. Simple. Uncertain. Real. For a brief second, the doubt returned. The quiet voice in her head. You don't belong here. You never did. Her hand tightened slightly, then relaxed. Because for the first time, she didn't push that voice away. She let it exist, and chose to move anyway. She stepped forward, pushed the door open, and walked inside. The lobby was quiet, polished, structured, the kind of place where people didn't hesitate, the kind of place where everyone knew exactly why they were there. Except, that wasn't true anymore. Because now, so did she. The receptionist looked up. Good morning. How can I help you? Lily straightened slightly. I have a 9 a.m. meeting. A small pause. With Ethan Cole. The moment hung there. Just long enough to matter. Then, the receptionist nodded. Lily Carter? Hearing her name here felt different. Not like a name tag. Not like something temporary. But something expected. Yes. They're expecting you. 3. Simple words. But they changed everything. Lily nodded. Quietly. Then walked toward the elevator. Each step steady. Measured. Not because she wasn't nervous. But because she wasn't running anymore. The elevator doors closed. Numbers lit up. One by one. Giving her just enough time to think. To turn back. To choose the familiar. But she didn't. When the doors opened, she stepped out. No hesitation. No pause. The hallway ahead was quiet. A conference room at the end. Voices inside. She stopped just for a second. Not out of fear, but awareness. This was it. Not the conversation. Not the possibility. The beginning. She took a breath. Then opened the door. The room was already in motion. Documents spread across the table. Professionals mid-discussion. And at the head of it, Ethan looked up. His eyes met hers immediately. No surprise. No question. Just recognition. You're on time. A faint hint of approval. Lily stepped inside. Closed the door behind her. The sound was soft, but definitive. And as she moved toward the table, something settled deep within her. She wasn't here to prove she belonged. She was here because she already did. The difference wasn't that she finally got an opportunity. It was that she finally stopped pretending she didn't deserve one.